Police pulled about 3 55-gallon drums out a couple hours ago.
We do not know where they were murdered. We do not know when they were murdered. And we do not know how long they have been in the barrel.
Judge steps into the serial killings investigation before charges are even filed.
He's put a gag order on all the major players in the Johnny Robinson case.
In this case, it's required by statute. In count 1, murder in the first degree, death.
It started with a lie, deception, and fatal decisions that ended with ultimate punishment. Demorris Hunter thought he could bury his past, while Willie Wilkins spent years fighting his conviction, insisting the courts had the wrong man. But these weren't crimes that ended with handcuffs. They ended with death sentences. And then came the moment they heard it. Let's begin.
That she was conscious during the strangulation process. She was conscious when the defendant had his hands wrapped around her neck and was squeezing the life out of her.
More than 20 years after a woman was killed inside her Orlando home, the case has finally reached its final chapter. Demorris Hunter was convicted of the murder, and now a judge must decide whether he will receive the death penalty recommended by the jury. On May 26, 2002, Teresa Green was at her home in Orlando when a gathering turned deadly. Hunter strangled Green, leaving her family waiting years for justice. Hunter was eventually convicted, but decades passed before the final punishment was decided. As investigators worked to build the case against Hunter, the 2002 murder remained an important part of the investigation. Hunter was eventually prosecuted for Green's death and brought before a jury more than 2 decades after the killing. By then, however, Hunter was already behind bars for another murder. In 2005, Hunter was convicted in California for the murder of another woman and sentenced to 110 years in prison. So when the Orlando case moved forward, he was already serving a lengthy sentence behind bars. But prosecutors continued pursuing the case involving Teresa Green. Earlier this year, Hunter was finally tried for Green's 2002 murder. After hearing the evidence, the jury found him guilty. But the courtroom proceedings were far from over. After finding Hunter guilty, the jury recommended the death penalty. That recommendation brought the case to a critical point, but the final decision would belong to the judge. Hunter's attorneys argued against sending him to death row, asking the judge to impose a different sentence. Prosecutors, however, continued to argue that Hunter should receive the death penalty. Both sides were given until July 1st to submit their sentencing recommendations. Then came the date that could finally determine Hunter's fate, August 4th, when the judge scheduled his sentencing hearing. The exact circumstances surrounding what led to Teresa Green's killing remain at the center of the case. Prosecutors said Hunter strangled Green during a gathering at her Orlando home in 2002, but the exact reason the confrontation turned deadly remains unclear. After more than 2 decades, Hunter now stands convicted of Teresa Green's murder, with a jury recommending the death penalty. He's already serving 110 years for the separate 2005 California murder, but the Orlando case could bring an even more severe punishment. Even the judge said,
"First-degree murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel."
And finally, the decision comes that Demorris Hunter was sentenced to death. However, he remained motionless throughout the verdict. For more than 20 years, Teresa Green's murder remained a painful chapter for those who knew her. Now, after a conviction and a jury recommendation for death, the case has reached the moment her family was waiting for. The next killer wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a teenager, and his response to an arrest turned a routine call into an officer's funeral.
The jury has found Marco Perez guilty of capital murder for shooting and killing Mobile police officer Sean Tudor.
A routine police arrest in Mobile, Alabama turned deadly when a young man wanted for several crimes came face to face with a police officer. Within moments, Officer Sean Tudor was dead, and 19-year-old Marco Perez was facing a capital murder charge that would eventually put him on death row. On January 20th, 2019, 19-year-old Marco Perez was already on probation when police began searching for him over multiple car thefts and a stolen firearm. Their search eventually led officers to an apartment complex where Mobile police officer Sean Tudor, a member of the department's gang unit, moved in to make the arrest. But before Perez could be taken into custody, a struggle broke out. Within moments, the confrontation turned deadly, and Perez shot Tudor 3 times. After the shooting, investigators began piecing together what had happened at the apartment complex. Investigators said that Perez had used the stolen firearm during the confrontation with Tudor. But Perez gave investigators a different version of events. He claimed he was acting in self-defense and said he did not know that Tudor was a police officer. The conflicting accounts became a central issue as the case moved toward trial. In 2024, Perez was finally tried for the 2019 killing of Officer Tudor. Prosecutors presented their evidence and argued that Perez knowingly shot the officer during the attempted arrest. Perez maintained his claim of self-defense, but the jury rejected that defense. They found Perez guilty and then faced another decision that would determine his future. After convicting Perez, the jury voted 11-1 in favor of the death penalty. The recommendation meant Perez would not simply face another lengthy prison sentence. His case was now headed toward death row. Perez appealed the decision, challenging the conviction and sentence. In May 2026, the Alabama Appeals Court issued a 108-page opinion reviewing the case. After considering the arguments, the court sentenced Marco Antonio Perez to death. The court concluded that the punishment was appropriate and found no indication that the sentence had been imposed because of passion, prejudice, or another improper factor. The exact reason Perez opened fire during the confrontation remains disputed. Prosecutors said the shooting happened while Officer Tudor was attempting to arrest Perez, who was already wanted in connection with several crimes. Perez, however, maintained that he believed he was defending himself and didn't know Tudor was a police officer. That claim became one of the central battles in the case, but the jury ultimately rejected it. With the appeals court now upholding his death sentence, Marco Perez remains on Alabama's death row. He breaks down in tears the moment the verdict is read. The court also determined that his punishment was not excessive or disproportionate compared with similar capital murder cases. For now, however, one important detail remains unknown. No execution date has been set. Officer Sean Tudor went to an apartment complex in 2019 as part of his job, expecting to make an arrest. Instead, the encounter ended with his death and changed the lives of everyone connected to the case. The killer in our next case used a spare key and a renovation job to get close enough to kill.
He will be going back to death row.
I hereby sentence the defendant, Rafael Andres, to death as to count 1 of the indictment.
A routine home renovation turned into a deadly crime. A waitress was found dead inside her burning home. And now, years later, the man convicted of killing her is back in court, facing the death penalty for a second time. On the morning of January 24, 2005, Rafael Andres used a spare key to enter the home where Yvette Fariñas lived with her boyfriend. Fariñas had trusted Andres enough to give him the key because he'd been hired to do renovation work at the home. But that morning, Andres entered with a different intention. He attacked Fariñas and repeatedly struck her in the face until she gave him the PIN for her ATM card. He then held her wrists and stabbed her 3 times in the chest. Despite the attack, Fariñas was still alive. Andres then placed a dish towel over her face and strangled her with the electrical cord from a rice cooker. After killing her, Andres left the home and later used Fariñas' ATM card to withdraw money, purchase items at the Home Depot, and pay for a stay at the Miccosukee Resort and Casino. Prosecutors said he took more than $1,600 in total. He later returned to the home and attempted to set it on fire, apparently trying to destroy evidence. But a neighbor reportedly saw Andres leaving the residence and called an emergency as the fire began. When firefighters arrived, they found Fariñas' body inside the burned home. Investigators eventually found evidence linking Andres to the crime. His cell phone records placed him near the scene. Traces of gasoline were found on his sneakers, and a gas can lid recovered at the scene matched a container found at his home. Investigators connected Andres to Fariñas' death, leading to his conviction for murder. In 2015, he was sentenced to death, but the case wasn't over. After an appeal, the Supreme Court ordered a new sentencing trial. That meant Andres would return to court years later, with a new judge deciding whether he should remain on death row or spend the rest of his life in prison. During the new sentencing trial, Andres' attorney asked the jury for life without the possibility of parole. In a 350-page letter submitted to the court, his defense argued that substance use had contributed to his violent behavior. But the jury reached the same conclusion as the first one. In 1998, Andres pled guilty to killing Linda Azcarreta. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison but served only 18 months. Linda's son, Rene Azcarreta, was only 7 years old when he discovered his mother's body. Years later, Andres was convicted of killing Fariñas, giving Rene another reason to question how Andres had been given a second chance. And finally, Rafael Andres was sentenced to death for a second time. But he remained silent while the verdict was read. Andres' sentence also made him the first Miami-Dade County inmate sent to death row in more than a decade. For Rene, the verdict was about more than just one courtroom decision. It was the end of a wait that had lasted for decades. He said he finally felt a massive weight had been lifted and that he could breathe a little easier. He also said that
my mother was full of life, always happy, always willing to help others when needed.
two families waited decades for justice. Now, Rafael Andres is back on death row. From there, we turn to another chilling case involving a killer, a U-Haul, a missing persons report, and a house hiding far more than anyone imagined.
She was no longer allowed to have her cell phone unless he was watching.
A final goodbye turned into a disappearance. A mother of two vanished after visiting a man who had once threatened her. Days later, police found her beneath his home, and 3 years later, a jury sentenced him to death. The trouble between Grimes and Osteen had started weeks earlier. On January 9th, 2022, Osteen was arrested for a household conflict offense involving Grimes. He had threatened to kill her and had refused to let her leave his house for several days. Eventually, Grimes managed to text her father, prompting police intervention. Osteen was released from jail on January 13th, but the court ordered him to wear an ankle monitor and issued an emergency protective order that prohibited him from contacting Grimes. Her family wanted her away from the situation, so they convinced her to move to West Texas. For a while, it appeared Grimes was ready to leave the relationship behind, but she and Osteen began talking and texting again, and eventually they started seeing each other. Then came February 12th. Grimes was driving a U-Haul packed with her belongings as she prepared to move. Before leaving, she stopped at Osteen's home to say goodbye. That evening, the two visited one of Osteen's neighbors, who later told investigators that Osteen threatened Grimes with a gun. After that night, Grimes disappeared. When Grimes failed to return, her family reported her missing. On February 21st, Fort Worth patrol officers found the U-Haul abandoned about a mile from Osteen's home. The vehicle was there, but Grimes was nowhere to be found. Officers began searching for her and soon focused their attention on Osteen's residence on Locke Avenue. The following day, police obtained a search warrant and entered the home. As investigators searched the property, they found evidence suggesting that a deceased person could be somewhere in or around the residence. The search continued until investigators discovered what they had been looking for. Grimes' body was found underneath the house. According to prosecutors, Osteen had dug a shallow grave beneath the home and then continued living above her body for about 10 days. The medical examiner determined that Grimes had been beaten to death, ruling her death a homicide caused by blunt force trauma to the head. By the time the case reached trial, prosecutors had presented the jury with a timeline that began with household conflict and threats, continued with Grimes' final visit to Osteen's home, and ended with her body being discovered beneath his house. Prosecutors argued that Osteen was angry because Grimes had reported him and wanted the charges dropped. They also said he wanted his ankle monitor removed and had told people he was going to kill her. The defense faced the evidence surrounding Grimes' disappearance, the condition of her body, and the location where investigators found her. Her defense also stated that Osteen's mental health was not stable at the time of the crime because of his troubled childhood. He said,
"The fact that his dad dies, his mom goes to prison, and his grandparents are killed. That's the mental image that's burned into this 8-year-old's mind."
After hearing the case, a Tarrant County judge found Osteen guilty of murdering Grimes. Prosecutors said the motive was connected to the conflict that had already brought police into Grimes and Osteen's lives. According to court documents, Osteen was angry about the household conflict charges and wanted Grimes to make them disappear. He also wanted the ankle monitor removed. Grimes' family, meanwhile, was trying to help her leave Texas and start somewhere new. She had packed her belongings into a U-Haul and was preparing to move to West Texas, but prosecutors said her decision to return to Osteen's home for one final goodbye gave him another opportunity to confront her. That goodbye became the last time she was seen alive. After investigators found Grimes beneath Osteen's home, the case moved toward trial. The Tarrant County District Attorney's Office argued that Osteen had the motive, opportunity, and desire to kill Grimes. The jury ultimately agreed and convicted him of murder. On September 22, 2025, Osteen was sentenced to death for the killing of the 26-year-old mother of two. The verdict came down, but his expression never changed. The courtroom grew heavy as the verdict was delivered. Her family friend said,
"She loved her children and worried about how to give them the best life possible."
The sentence brought the legal case to a major turning point, but for Grimes' family, no verdict could change what had already been lost. After years of fear, loss, and waiting for justice, the courtroom finally gave Grimes' family an answer. The next case started with a story about a girl hiding in a box, and ended with a jury deciding 2 adults deserved to die for it.
To the woman now charged with killing her 10-year-old cousin, Amy Deal, back in 2011.
A little girl was found dead inside a storage box, and her family said she had climbed in herself. Then investigators uncovered why she was really inside, and the truth ended with a death sentence. On July 12, 2011, police were called to a home in South Phoenix after teenager Amy Deal was found dead inside a plastic storage box. The adults living in the house told investigators that Amy had a habit of hiding inside the box and suggested she had climbed inside the night before and fallen asleep. At first, that explanation offered one answer to a heart-wrenching discovery. As police investigated Amy's death, the original explanation given by the adults in the home came under scrutiny. The question was no longer simply how Amy had ended up inside the box. Investigators wanted to know why she had been put there. Their investigation eventually led to Samantha Allen and her husband, John Allen. Authorities later determined that the punishment began over something as simple as a popsicle. After Amy took one from the freezer, she was forced into a small plastic storage box. The lid was locked shut, trapping Amy inside. She was left there overnight, and by morning, Amy had suffocated. Authorities said Amy had been subjected to painful punishments, including being beaten, forced to perform difficult tasks barefoot, and subjected to other forms of mistreatment. Her death, investigators concluded, was the culmination of years of mistreatment rather than a tragic accident. And the case didn't stop with Samantha Allen. Other adults in Amy's life were also prosecuted for their roles in abusing the child. The case eventually went to trial, where prosecutors argued that Samantha Allen was responsible for Amy's death. In June 2017, a jury convicted Allen of first-degree murder and 4 counts of child mistreatment. But the most important decision was still ahead. The jury had to determine whether Allen should spend the rest of her life in prison or receive the death penalty. According to prosecutors, Amy was being punished for stealing an ice pop when she was forced into the storage box. What began as a punishment became fatal when the child was left trapped inside overnight. But investigators said the circumstances surrounding her death could not be separated from the larger pattern of mistreatment Amy had endured. The storage box was repeatedly used as a form of punishment before, and authorities said Amy had repeatedly been subjected to harsh treatment by adults in the home. For prosecutors, the issue was not simply what happened on that final night. It was the pattern of behavior that had led to it. Samantha Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and 4 counts of child mistreatment and sentenced to death in August 2017. The judge said,
"The court is required to immediately sentence the defendant to death."
Other relatives were also held accountable. Amy's mother and legal guardian, Cynthia Stoltzman, received 24 years in prison and lifetime probation after pleading guilty to mistreatment charges. Amy's grandmother, Judith Deal, received 10 years in prison and lifetime probation. Her father, David Deal, received 14 years in prison for attempted mistreatment. Allen's husband, John Allen, also faced murder charges and the possibility of the death penalty. Samantha cried as the verdict was read and later hugged her attorneys before being taken for the courtroom. Amy should have been protected by the adults around her, but the same adults subjected her to repeated mistreatment before the final punishment that ended her life. When Samantha Allen received the death sentence, juror Ann Schad said the lack of remorse she saw throughout the case was one of the factors that influenced the jury. For Amy's family and to everyone who had waited for justice, the verdict could not undo what happened to a girl who had been left without the protection she needed. Our next case shows how killing a witness didn't bury the truth. It sealed the fate of a killer.
This morning, he told the jury that he didn't want to die. He wants his life spared so he can continue to have a relationship with his 3 children.
A girlfriend was dead, and one man knew what had happened. But 7 months later, that witness was shot and killed too, turning one murder into a case that would eventually end with a death sentence. On July 26, 2008, McKelton and his girlfriend, Fairfield attorney Margaret Allen, got into an argument. During the confrontation, McKelton strangled Allen, killing her. His friend, Jermaine Mick Evans, was there and later helped McKelton dispose of Allen's body. But Evans knew too much. The crime sent McKelton to court, where he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the case took another deadly turn when Jermaine Evans Sr., a witness to Allen's murder, was shot and killed on March 1, 2009, just 7 months later. Investigators began connecting Evans' death to the earlier murder, and prosecutors argued that McKelton had a reason to target him. Evans had witnessed Allen's killing, making him a witness against McKelton. The second murder therefore raised a chilling possibility. Was Evans killed to keep him from telling the truth? McKelton was eventually convicted of Evans' murder and sentenced to death. But the case continued for years as his attorneys challenged the conviction, arguing that he had received inadequate legal representation and raising claims of prosecutorial misconduct. Prosecutors said Evans was not killed at random. They argued that he was targeted because he had witnessed Allen's murder and could testify against McKelton. In 2016, the Ohio Supreme Court reviewed McKelton's arguments and rejected them in a 5-2 decision, upholding his death sentence for Evans' murder. At the time of sentencing, he said,
"My son, even from prison, I can help him not make the same mistakes I have made."
However, he remained expressionless as the judge read the verdict. Margaret Allen's murder had already left one family grieving. Then, just 7 months later, another life was lost. Evans had seen what happened to Allen, and prosecutors said that knowledge ultimately made him a target. 2 murders, 1 witness, and a death sentence that would follow McKelton for years. The killer in the next case turned the Las Vegas Strip into the scene of a deadly chase that claimed 3 lives in a single night.
Jurors found him guilty on 11 charges. You're looking at file video now, including 3 counts of murder.
A nightclub argument turned into a deadly chase across the Las Vegas Strip. 1 man was shot behind the wheel, and minutes later, a fiery crash claimed 2 more lives. Amar Harris was eventually convicted of all 3 murders and sentenced to death. In the early mornings of February 21, 2013, Harris spotted Kenneth Cherry Jr. driving a Maserati after the two had been involved in an earlier confrontation. Harris pulled alongside Cherry and cut him off. Then, without warning, he raised a gun and fired into the Maserati. Cherry was hit and lost control of the car. Harris continued following him as the wounded driver sped through the strip. Moments later, the Maserati slammed into a taxi, killing taxi driver Michael Bolden and passenger Sandra Sutton-Wasmond. The shooting quickly became a massive investigation. Detectives collected surveillance footage and witness statements that helped reconstruct the chase. Investigators eventually connected Harris to the shooting, and he was arrested in Los Angeles about a week later. At trial, Harris admitted shooting Cherry, but claimed he believed he was defending himself. The jury rejected that explanation. After only about 30 minutes of deliberation, Harris was found guilty of the murders and other charges connected to the shooting. The conflict began with an argument at a nightclub. Harris later encountered Cherry on the strip, and what could have ended with both men simply driving away instead became a deadly confrontation. The case then moved into the penalty phase. Prosecutors asked jurors to consider the deaths of 3 people and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. The jury ultimately chose death, and Harris received 3 death sentences. However, he showed no reaction as the verdict was announced. For the victims' families, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but nothing could erase the night that took 3 lives. Kenneth Cherry's parents mourned their son, while Michael Bolden's family was left grieving a man who had simply been working his shift when the deadly attack reached his taxi. The next killer didn't leave his house to find victims. Fake names, fake promises, and a computer screen were all he needed to lure them in.
John Robinson is on death row. He killed 6 women in the mid-1980s, but was not arrested until 2000.
A missing woman led police to a farmhouse, and what they found inside revealed a killer who had been hiding behind fake names, fake promises, and even internet relationships for years. Robinson targeted women who trusted him. He promised jobs, money, relationships, and a better life. But behind those promises was something far darker. In 1999, he met 21-year-old Isabella Luica online. Robinson presented himself as a wealthy businessman and entered into a controlling relationship with her. After Luica disappeared, he claimed she had been deported. A year later, another woman, Suzette Troughton, moved to Kansas to live with Robinson, and she soon vanished too. But Robinson had made a mistake. He believed Suzette Troughton had vanished without a trace, but she hadn't. Robinson had left something behind, evidence that would slowly tear through his carefully constructed lies and expose the darker world he had hidden from everyone. In June 2000, Robinson was arrested after authorities received complaints against him. Investigators obtained search warrants and searched his Kansas farm. There, they discovered 2 chemical drums. Inside were the bodies of Luica and Troughton. Investigators then searched a Missouri storage facility connected to Robinson. 3 more drums were found, containing the remains of Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Faith's teenage daughter, Debbie. Investigators also found evidence Robinson never expected investigators to find. He had kept journal pages filled with details about the women who entered his life. As investigators examined those entries, they began seeing a disturbing pattern of deception, manipulation, and control, and Troughton's name was among them. The discovery transformed a missing person investigation into a serial murder case. The case reached the courtroom, but prosecutors soon uncovered something far darker. Robinson's crimes appeared to extend well beyond the charges before the court. Investigators linked him to women who had vanished after entering his world. Some bodies were never recovered. Robinson had used aliases, forged documents, false stories, and online identities to control the women around him. His alias, Slave Master, made him one of the earliest known serial killers to use the internet to lure victims. Robinson's motive centered on control. He gained access to vulnerable women by offering them security, employment, relationships, or financial help. Once they trusted him, he took control of their money, movements, and lives. For some, that relationship ended in disappearance and murder. In 2002, Robinson was convicted in Kansas for 3 murders, including the killings of Suzette Troughton and Isabella Luica. He received 2 death sentences for Troughton and Luica, while receiving life imprisonment for Lisa Stassi's murder. However, he didn't have any regrets for the heinous crimes he committed. 2 years later, Robinson admitted responsibility for 5 additional murders in Missouri. He received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. In 2015, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned some of his convictions on technical grounds, but upheld Luica's murder conviction and death sentence. Robinson remains on death row in Kansas.
Governor Laura Kelly denies a request from convicted serial killer John Robinson for clemency on his death sentence.
8 women are known to have been killed or attributed to Robinson, but investigators have long feared the real number could be higher. However, some victims disappeared without leaving behind a body, an explanation, or a final goodbye. The next killer wiped out an entire family in a single night, then tried to burn the evidence along with the town's sense of safety.
A death sentence triggers an automatic appeal to the state Supreme Court, which Jones's attorney says he is interested in pursuing.
A quiet Nebraska town was rocked by 4 murders in one night. 2 homes were set on fire, 4 people were shot dead, and the suspect was found badly burned the next morning. 4 years later, the culprit finally stood before a court and received a sentence that could end his life. On August 4th, 2022, the town of Laurel was shaken by a quadruple homicide. Jean Twyford, 86, Janet Twyford, 85, Dana Twyford, 55, and Michelle Ebling, 53 were killed. After the killings, fires were set at 2 Laurel homes. What began as a series of deaths quickly became a massive investigation, and before long, investigators focused on 46-year-old Jason Jones. Jones was eventually charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of using a firearm to commit a felony, and 2 counts of second-degree arson. The investigation took a major turn when Jones was found at his Laurel home suffering from severe burns. He was taken to the hospital before being placed in jail. Investigators continued working to reconstruct what had happened on August 4th. The evidence ultimately led to a 10-count criminal case against Jones. The case centered on 4 killings, the use of firearms, and the fires that followed. September 2024 brought the case to its most critical moment. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented the evidence they said tied Jason Jones to the 4 killings and the 2 fires. The defense fought the charges, but after hearing both sides, the jury reached its decision. Jones was found guilty on all 10 felony counts, 4 counts of first-degree murder, 4 firearm charges, and 2 counts of second-degree arson. Prosecutors didn't establish a clear motive for why Jones targeted the 4 victims. That remains an important distinction in the case. What was established in court was what happened afterwards. 4 people were dead, 2 homes had been burned, and Jones was convicted of the killings and related offenses. On April 10, 2026, the case reached its final sentencing stage.
In this case, as required by statute, in count 1, murder in the first degree, death.
A 3-judge panel sentenced Jason Jones to death for the murders of Jean Twyford, Janet Twyford, Dana Twyford, and Michelle Ebling. The decision made Jones the 12th man on Nebraska's death row. He also received additional prison sentences, 3 to 4 years for each of the 2 arson convictions and 40 to 50 years for each of the 4 firearm convictions. Jones's wife, Carrie Jones, was also convicted in connection with the case. She received life in prison for the first-degree murder of Jean Twyford, plus additional sentences for tampering with physical evidence and being an accessory to a felony. After the death sentence was handed down, Nebraska Attorney General Mike Hilgers praised the 3-judge panel and the investigators who worked on the case. For Laurel, the numbers only tell part of the story, and a case that began with 4 killings in a small Nebraska town ended with Jason Jones condemned to death. The killer in the next case spent years trying to prove the courts got it wrong and lost every time.
The murder trial of Willie Wilkins Jr. entered week 2 today. So far, no opening statements or testimony because a jury hasn't been picked yet.
A Youngstown shooting left one woman dead and 2 others wounded. Years later, the man convicted in the attack would fight to overturn his death sentence, claiming the wrong man had been identified. In 2013, Aurora Wilkins was fatally shot in the head with a rifle in Youngstown, Ohio. 2 other people were also shot at, but survived the attack. Willie Wilkes was later convicted of Wilkins' murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to death. But Wilkes denied having anything to do with the shooting. His defense pointed to 2 witnesses who described the shooter as having dreadlocks. Wilkes did not have dreadlocks, and that difference became a major part of his argument. Investigators built the case around witness accounts of the shooting and the person they believed was responsible. The witness's description of a shooter with dreadlocks became important during Wilkes' legal challenges. But the case still went before a jury. After hearing the evidence, the jury found Wilkes guilty of murdering Wilkins and attempting to kill the 2 survivors. The conviction eventually put him on death row. Years after the shooting, Wilkes' case reached the Ohio Supreme Court. His attorney, John Parker, argued that Wilkes had not received a fair trial. He said the jury should have heard from witnesses about the person described as having dreadlocks, but the court rejected the challenge. The exact reason for the shooting was not explained in the report. What is known is that the attack left Aurora Wilkins dead and 2 other people injured. Wilkes continued to deny involvement, while his defense continued to question the identification of the shooter. In a unanimous ruling, the Ohio Supreme Court upheld Wilkes' death sentence. However, he remained silent through the verdict. The Ohio Supreme Court's decision left Wilkes' conviction intact. His death sentence also remained in place. The 46-year-old continued to face execution for Wilkins' murder, along with the 2 attempted murder convictions involving the people who survived the shooting. For Aurora Wilkins' family, years of court proceedings could never change the loss of a loved one. For Wilkes' attorney, the ruling was a painful setback because he believed important witness testimony had never been properly heard. But after the unanimous decision, there was no change to the sentence. The conviction stood, the death sentence stood, and the case moved another step toward its final chapter. Different killers, different crimes, different courtrooms, but each ended the same way, with a judge or jury choosing death. None of it brings back what was lost. For the families left behind, the sentence closes a case file, but it doesn't close the wound. The waiting is over. The grief isn't. And if you want even more content, join our membership for exclusive videos and early access to every upload. Your support helps us keep telling these stories. Join buttons below or scan the QR code on screen now. Thanks for watching.